The Gospel, according to John, ends by saying the author wrote the stories of Jesus with a specific purpose, that the audience would believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that through believing, the audience would have life in his name, and that so many stories were written about Jesus that books couldn't hold them all. Most Bible scholars believe that this particular gospel, John, was not written down until 90 to 120 AD, sometime after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, it's believed that the other three gospels were written sometime between 60 and 95 AD, again, sometime after the death of Jesus. Written words were not as abundant, they weren't as popular or inexpensive back then as they are now. In fact, the first stories of Jesus were not written down at all. People were telling them, were telling stories about Jesus, telling stories about his life, his miracles, and his teachings. The people did not have a Bible to pick up like we do today to learn about Jesus. They heard the stories through the telling about him. The four evangelists wrote the stories down so that they wouldn't be lost. The generation of people who lived at the time of Jesus was dying off, and the authors wanted to preserve these stories. You know, I got in trouble one time in a church for referring to what I call stories in the Bible as stories, because for the person that was confronting me, they heard stories as fiction, rather than something to learn something from, or from actual stories, actual episodes in people's lives. I love to tell stories. Some of the stories I tell are true, some are my stories, some are from the Bible. I love to tell stories because we can connect with the stories. The author's intention was not for a person to sit quietly alone and read the stories in their own heads. This was back when the Gospels were written. The stories were meant to be read out loud, to be shared, to be experienced. In fact, in the 4th century, St. Augustine was discovered sitting alone in his room, reading the Bible quietly with his lips moving, and he was thought to be mad, crazy for doing that. No one sat and read the Bible quietly in those days. There was an ancient church law, I might have mentioned it before, that said that people must stay for the sermon and preferably also for the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper when they came to church. This law was created because people were gathering in church to listen to 60 to 90 minutes of gospel reading, which was the practice back then. We're talking decades, centuries ago. And then they were leaving because they felt fulfilled by the gospel readings. They were rejuvenated before the preacher even got in the pulpit. The stories of the gospel were what the people really wanted to hear. Telling and listening to a story has the same structure as our own life experiences, but the episodes of our lives take place one after the other, just like in a story, just like in the stories about Jesus. I was told once that our own lives could be called the fifth gospel. Our lives are the stories of Jesus at work in my life, in your lives. We each have our own stories of faith that we can tell. And the telling of a story to another person or group is different than reading a book. Storytelling has its own unique dynamics. It can be fun, engaging, spontaneous, and playful even. To say, "Let me tell you a story," is like saying, "Let's go play together." Storytelling creates community. The telling of stories binds human beings together. Connections are made. Relationships are formed when people can identify with the same stories. Storytelling can also be highly emotional. To laugh and to cry, to be deeply moved and to get so involved that you know how the story came out in the end. That's what storytelling is all about. I watched a movie recently. It's titled The Cokeville Miracle. I don't know if you've seen it. It was on Netflix or Prime some time ago. It took place back in the mid-'80s. It was a story of a husband and wife who took over a school in a small town of about 500 people. They demanded $2 million for each child held hostage. It equaled about $308 million. There were firearms and a bomb brought to the school. 154 students were enclosed in a single classroom. Stuff happened. Sad stuff. Scary for kids stuff happened. I kept telling myself, it's just a story, Billie, it's just a movie, because I kept tearing up. I was so impacted by the story I was watching. Imagine my shock when I discovered at the end that it was based on a true story. Stories impact our lives. Through stories, we get to know other people, and we get to know ourselves as well. And the stories we remember and tell to others become the best gifts that we have to give one another. William Young, what was the book that he wrote? The Shack. That was a story he wrote for his children. He didn't intend for it to be a bestseller. He wrote it for his children, I think at Christmas time. And it just grew and grew and grew in popularity. It was just a story that he told. I had a personal experience that involved the hearing of stories that changed my life. In June of 1981, I attended a marriage encounter weekend. I think I've shared that before. Over the 3-day experience, 4 couples offered the gift of their life stories. These stories were quite personal and touched me deeply. Because these folks willingly shared their stories, I was able to be open enough for the first time in my life to believe in and accept God's love for me through storytelling. It was because of the sense of community that was built in the midst of stories being told that I stepped into the Christian faith 43 years ago. Now, there are a lot of stories in the world. Every human community has its stories. There's something about the stories of the Gospels, though, that make them distinctive. The stories of Jesus, as told by his followers, uniquely reveal the very character of God. Jesus told his disciples when they saw him that they saw the Father. The stories of Jesus' birth, his ministry of healing and reconciliation, his teachings and his death, and his resurrection became for them stories about the decisive and central action of God in all of human history. In telling and listening to the stories of Jesus, early Christians made connections with their own lives that made clear to them how God was very present in their lives. The stories in the Bible are our stories. And I think we learned that in Sunday school. There are things in the Bible that we can relate to, that we can look at ourselves to figure out how better to live our lives. I can relate to Paul and his Damascus Road experience. Some folks recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread, like the 2 who met Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Some folks recognize themselves as they read about Joseph and his disconnect with his brothers. Some see themselves as an outcast, like the woman at the well, and yet encounter Jesus in a powerful way. Yes, we can connect with the stories of the Bible. As we sit quietly and read the Bible in our heads, though, we don't get the full impact of the words. Many Bible study authors suggest reading the words of a passage out loud in order to get a fuller understanding of the meaning. The words in Scripture were meant to be heard and not merely read and kept inside our heads. I want to share a gospel story with you, and I'd like for you to repeat it after me. Let's tell the story together. So if you turn to the back of your bulletin, please. Let's read this story together. I'll read and then you repeat. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds.
Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds.
And I'm going to encourage you to do more than just read it, but to feel it and speak it with some enthusiasm. I taught a middle schooler years ago to read this particular passage because it was Youth Sunday at the church. And when we get to the part where they say, "It's a ghost," this young man let us know it was a ghost. Okay. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray.
And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray.
When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them.
When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them.
And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea.
And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea.
But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!"
But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!"
Yes, yes, yes. And they cried out in fear.
And they cried out in fear.
But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid."
But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid."
Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water."
Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water."
He said, "Come."
He said, "Come."
So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus.
So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus.
But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!"
When he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!"
Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?"
Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?"
When they got into the boat, the wind ceased.
When they got into the boat, the wind ceased.
And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This story is about fear, the fear of irrational forces that are symbolized in the storm, the wind, and the perceived ghost. The fear of these forces can make one feel cowardly, resigned, alone. I remember living out on the prairie alone and feeling scared and alone, especially during really bad storms. I think about the little girl who got scared at night and called out to her daddy. He calmed her down and went to leave, and she said, no, please stay." And he said, "Don't worry, Jesus is here with you." And the little girl said, "I know, but I want someone with skin on." This story we read in Matthew is an experience of testing the fear of those powers, discovering who is truly in control, and taking the first steps toward true discipleship. Jesus, we learned, was separated from his disciples. He was up in the hills praying. The disciples are far from land, being beaten about by the wind. I have never been in a boat myself in bad weather, but my imagination and hearing other people's stories about the danger tell me I would not feel safe. The disciples were on a lonely and frightening journey. The fourth watch of night, the New Revised Standard Version simply says it was early in the morning. The fourth watch tells us that the disciples had spent most of the night trying to cross the sea. It wasn't evening when they left the shore, and here it was in the middle of the night. The Romans divided the night watch from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. into 4 3-hour shifts. So the fourth watch was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., a dark and spooky time of night, a time when spirits were believed to be walking among the tombs. The gospel author heightens the emotional element by describing the fear 3 times. They were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Jesus was in total control, though. The episode expresses the extreme fear of the disciples and the peaceful calm of Jesus. Jesus' words are calming, and yet his actions, walking on the water, speaking to the disciples while he's walking, and using the divine name I am, or Yahweh, all portray strange and alien events to the men on the boat. Again, the NRSV translates this passage as Jesus saying, "It is I." In Greek, the Greek language says ego eimi, or I am, which in Hebrew would be Yahweh, or I am who I am, or I am who I am becoming. Jesus is saying, I am who I am. You see me. We lose something in the translation. Jesus is claiming the name of God, Yahweh, I am. It is I. Jesus is clearly different here in this scene than the average human being. And then we have Peter, with the spirit of a child without fear, responds to Jesus' command, "Have no fear," by asking Jesus to call him out to walk on the water if it's really him. In good cheer and in spirit of high adventure, Jesus calls him forth, simply saying, "Come." There's a sense of wonder and victory, a real attaboy, as Peter steps out of the boat and walks towards Jesus. Suddenly, though, Peter loses his sense of confidence and success and cries out in panic as he sinks into the water. Did you know that people in the first century didn't know they could swim?
Really?
They had no understanding that they could swim. So Peter's crying out as he's sinking. It has a desperate tone to it. Can you hear him? "Lord, help me." Then there are many interpreters who hear Jesus' words to Peter as a judgment, as being harsh and critical. Perhaps the words were more like that of a coach. As they stand there on the water together, Jesus has hold of Peter by the hand, and with a voice that suggests maybe even a little teasing, but is also clearly disappointed, Jesus says, "Oh, why did you lose confidence and blow it? You almost did it." Jesus is present and gently supportive, even in the face of failure. That's the way I read it. The story ends in a return to the calm of the story's beginning, and in the appropriate response of the disciples, which is worship. We can respect Peter for his attempt, his near miss, and we can recognize the presence and support of Jesus in the places that are scary in our own lives. This story is about fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the powers beyond our control. I want to invite you now to think of a time when you were really frightened, a time when you were afraid in the night maybe. Maybe you heard something or saw something that scared you. Maybe you were a child or a teenager and saw something that scared you. Maybe it happened even recently. We all have our own places and times of fear. There's an author, Tom Boomersheim, who wrote a book about storytelling and the Gospels. He tells a story of fear. I want to share this with you just to kind of spark your memory of your own time of being scared. Boomersheim wrote, "When I was 10, my friend Jim Pethley and I were sledding in the park. It was one of those days when shadows scuttled across the snow from the variations in the cloud cover. Although the park was in the middle of town, it was about a half a mile wide, with a creek running down through the middle of it, and it was pretty desolate. Lots of woods and scruffy shrubs. On a hill across from the park was a cemetery. Usually there were lots of kids sledding, but on this particular day, no one else was there, just Pethley and me. Now, Pethley had a powerful imagination, and so did I. And he also liked to play tricks on me. We were having a great time on this slope. Down there in the park, we couldn't see anybody else. It was a little spooky, but the sledding was so good, we didn't care. Still, I remember saying to Pefley, "Man, it sure is quiet down here." And we would stop for a second and listen to the wind and look out across that broad expanse of snow at the shadows on the snow. We got back to the top of the hill and were about to make another run when Pefley said, "Hey, Boomer, did you see that? Over there in the cemetery. It looked like something was moving." I looked across the valley. It was more than a quarter of a mile, and I didn't see anything except for some trees and tombstones. "Nah, I don't see anything." Pefley said, "Well, it must have just been my imagination, but I'd swear I saw something moving over there." And we looked again, but there was nothing. Now, Pefley's comment changed the atmosphere. The whole place started to look ominous. The trees, the snow, and it seemed to get darker. We kept on sledding, trying to be cheerful and to ignore the gathering gloom. But it just got scarier and scarier. Suddenly, Pefley cried out, "Look, it's a panther!" I looked, and I swear to this day that I saw a big black panther running down through the cemetery, leaping over fences and across that snow-covered field toward us. We turned around and ran. Pefley had to take a different route than I did to get to his house, so I took off alone in the other direction. I had to run through the woods for about 100 yards. I could hear the panther behind me getting closer and closer. I had on my old clumsy boots with metal buckles, and the sled kept banging into my heels. I was terrified. Once I got out of the woods, I had to run through a series of back alleys and then run behind other houses in town to get to my house, a quarter mile or so. I could feel that panther getting closer and closer, about ready to pounce. And then about 100 feet from the house, the sled banged into my heels and I tripped and fell down. As I fell, I knew that this was it. I waited for a second to feel the panther's hot breath and his claws in my back. When it didn't come, much to my surprise, I scrambled up, dropped my sled rope, and ran into the house. I was crying and absolutely frantic. Mom said, What happened?" Trying to catch my breath, I told her, "Pefley saw a panther down at the park. In the cemetery, it was after me." She smiled gently, apparently knowing something about panthers that I didn't know. I remember thinking there weren't panthers in our region of the country, but panthers escape from zoos all the time. Mom said, "Well, who saw it?" "Pefley saw it first, but then it was coming across the field from the cemetery. I saw it." Mom knew my imagination. She knew how gullible I was and how susceptible I was to suggestion. And she knew Pefley. She smiled again. "Okay, Pefley saw it first. Well, just take off your coat and your boots. How about some hot chocolate?" Whenever Boomershine tells the story of Jesus walking on the water and the fear of the disciples, he remembers that moment when he fell down and knew that panther was about to leap on his back. He remembers his absolute panic, his mom's smiling calm. The stories are different, but the dynamics are similar. And this helps him get in touch with the vitality of Matthew's story. Now, real quickly, in my own life, in the 1970s, that's back when we had you wouldn't remember, we had energy crisis and we were being careful about lights. I had a daughter she was probably 3 at the time, and my husband was off to college for the evening, and I took Andy upstairs to give her a bath, and I shut off all the lights downstairs because I was energy aware. Gave her a bath. As I was cleaning out the tub and freshening up the bathroom, I said, "Go find a book for me to read to you." And evidently she went downstairs and got a book and brought it upstairs, and I read her a book, shut her bedroom door, and I went to go downstairs, and I could see there was a light on, and I knew I'd shut all the lights off. And I couldn't figure out, how could there be a light on? Is there somebody else in the house with me? And I just was frozen on the stairs, totally frozen. And I very quietly, I was down a couple of stairs, I very quietly backed up those stairs, went into the bedroom and quietly called my next door neighbor and asked him if he would come over to check on things. And he said, are the doors locked? And I said, yes, they are. And he said, okay, I'll meet you at the bottom of the stairs, which was by the front door, and you let me in, and I'll look over the house. And we did that. I still couldn't figure out how that light came on. And he left, and my husband got home about an hour later, and I was telling him the story. And he said, I gave it away. He said, did Andy come downstairs to get a book? And I said, yeah. What 3-year-old goes in the dark to find a book? She turned the light on. But I couldn't think. Now I want to tell you the Matthew story one more time. Hopefully you have one of your own fearful times in your mind. I'm not going to sermonize or tell you what you're supposed to think or feel. Just think of your own scary experience and see if there's any connection you can find with this story. I was terrified by the light and my husband's calm presence. He figured it out. He was logical. See if there's any connection you can find with this story. The terror in the night, the calm of someone who cares about you, the courage to step out on your own, the support of a loved one. Hear the story again. Immediately, he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." From what fear might God be inviting you to heal from? How has God expressed love and concern in support of his supportive presence to you? From what security is God asking you to step away from in faith in order to experience a new blessing? When the spiritual energy of a gospel story connects with the spiritual need of a person, like the need to deal with fear or find courage for the unknown, we can better understand God's presence in real and unique ways in our own lives. Tell me the stories of Jesus. These stories are places where we can find healing, love, support, courage. Read the stories. Connect your own stories. Find the divine in them. There are many other stories in the Gospels. There's humor and heartbreak. There are texts of terror. There's instruction and guidance, poetry and love stories. Know that the Bible stories are our stories. That as we look to them, we can see ourselves. And if we see God in the lives of the saints of Scripture, we can better trust that God is with us as well. Amen.